So, good afternoon from Nairobi. My name is Alex Bynes and I'm the Director of the Africa Programme at Chatham House. And I'm delighted to be chairing today this webinar, Policy Recovery in Africa, Partnership for Sustainable Development. So, as you know, the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed an urgent need for multilateral partnerships to tackle development inequalities and vulnerabilities. So, sustainable development has been put on the back burner, whilst many come to terms with the destabilising nature of the pandemic, put into stark relief again because of the new variant that was identified in South Africa and the kind of barriers that are appearing again in parts of the African continent. However, the disruption of social and economic norms has also created an opportunity for profound change. Global collaboration can provide an opportunity for the world to systematically shift to a more sustainable approach. So at this event, I'm hoping that our panelists will identify the roles, responsibilities, and expectations of different stakeholders in working towards sustainable development and the impediments to achieving the Agenda 2063 and obviously the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. So a few kind of ground rules of this meeting, that this meeting is fully on the record. We are participating through Zoom, and also welcome to those who are joining via Facebook Live. I'm sorry if you're on Facebook Live, you're not going to be able to ask a question, but we're very grateful that you're joining us today, and I'm aware of quite a few people across the African continent. This event is also held as part of the Policy for Recovery in Africa series, which is a partnership between Chatham House and the UNDP, which brings together expert speakers and decision makers to examine and exchange the key challenges, potential solutions and approaches for implementation as African countries confront the shocks of the COVID-19 pandemic. The series provides careful analysis and evidence-based policy solutions towards recovery and progress towards the SDGs and the AU's Agenda 2063. I can't think of anything more important than this discussion, myself being in Nairobi at the moment, having just spent 3 weeks on the continent and being impacted by the new variant in Southern Africa. We're finding flights and borders suddenly being closed and having to work through that. Now, this event will be held in English and French with simultaneous interpretation throughout. So participants may use the interpretation function in the Zoom control bar to select their preferred language. So if you are a Francophone speaker, then bienvenue. And you will find the French simultaneous translation interpretation available for you. All attendees will be muted during the presentations, but please do use your raise hand function during the Q&A in order to ask a question live. If you're selected, we'll be able to come to you and we'll kind of unmute you. As I've already mentioned unfortunately, if you're on Facebook Live, we're not going to be able to take questions. So finally, again, just a reminder that although this is a Chatham House meeting, this event is on the record. We are filming and recording the event, and so it will be available publicly. And please, if you are tweeting, you're very welcome to use the hashtag #CHAfrica. So with no more ado, I just want to thank our panel for speaking today. We have lost one panelist who has flu. The test shows that they do not have COVID. And that's Chris Mittman from Investec. So we wish him good health and that he gets better soon, but he can't join us today. But we have Laurel Patterson, who's the head of SDG integration at UNDP, and she's based in New York. We have Hannah Ryder, who is the CEO of Development Reimagined, and Hannah's actually in Dakar at the moment. And finally, we also have Florence Sevu, the country coordinator of SDGs Kenya, and she's based in Kenya with me right at the moment. I believe she's in Nairobi. So I want to first introduce to you Laurel Patterson. As I told you, she's the Director for SDG integration in the UNDP's Global Policy Network. Laurel was previously a senior global policy advisor leading policy development for SDG implementation in fragile and conflict-affected settings. She's also been a deputy director of the UN Systems Affairs Group leading on UN reform. And there is a very lengthy bio of Laurel's, which is available on our website, and those in Zoom will be able to see that. So my apologies, Laurel, you've done so much. You're so amazing. I just I'm going to cut time and just not read it all out. So I'm going to turn now to Laurel to make her first remarks, and then I will introduce Hannah as the second speaker. So Laurel, welcome to this Chatham House webinar, and I hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Alex, thank you so much. Colleagues, good morning and good afternoon from everywhere that you're joining us today. I'm really delighted to be here. And as Alex also says, I can't imagine a more important topic at a more important time. When we look at some of the global perception polls which have been running lately, we see a real waning in the commitment or the willingness that people had previously expressed for change, not only to adhere to some of the changes which had been required as a result of COVID, but to go further, to reimagine other aspects of their life, change other aspects of their day-to-day behavior, because those changes would be the things that could help us shift systems and development trajectories, et cetera. And we're seeing a shift in that. The economic implications of COVID are deepening. Our ability, our resilience to continue to weather storms is waning. And I think this has to be a moment where we ask ourselves, what needs to endure? What have we learned? What can we take forward from this most profound disruption that we faced towards pathways that are not a function of fixing what's broken in the systems, but reimagining those trajectories themselves. And I'm happy to share a little bit with you today where our thinking is at on this. I'm sharing my screen. This is always the scariest part of a presentation. I think I'm up. So what I wanted to share a little bit with you today is first some insights. How are we seeing COVID recovery? What does that look like in terms of the SDGs? I want to put a particular focus in my first remarks on vaccine injustice, vaccine inequity as an incredible driver of disruption and potential negative implications, particularly for the Africa region. So I'd like to focus on that, and then of course really welcome the discussion with the other panelists around partnerships, collaboration, et cetera, to take this forward. One of the things that's very important for us in UNDP is understanding options, potential pathways, different futures and their implications, and working with our partners and with our stakeholders to identify those that can provide the most optimal benefits across different aspects of sustainable development in different communities. And so what I'm showing you here right now is some of the findings of a study which we put out last year and continue to work on, assessing COVID impact on the SDGs to 2030 and to 2050. And what we find in that study is that by 2030, the vast majority of people who are pushed into poverty as a direct result of COVID, 8 out of 10 of those people are living in the poorest countries in the world. And 58 million of those people would be on the African continent. That is in addition to, that is a direct impact caused by COVID. We mapped this out a little bit further across a couple of different scenarios, which I'd like to just take a minute to tell you about. We created a number of scenarios with our partners at the University of Denver to be able to assess potential futures that we could experience as a result of COVID. One was a baseline scenario, and that more or less reflects the kinds of impact that we had seen to date. Second was a high damage scenario, where recovery is much more fractured, much more stunted, mortality is higher, recovery is delayed. Frankly, when we built this scenario, it seemed right on the edge of unrealistic. And today, unfortunately, it doesn't seem unrealistic at all. We're actually updating this scenario to reflect the implications of vaccine injustice. And finally, and because it really is important at this point that we are looking to what's possible and we're bringing an evidence base to back that up so that we can make changes in that direction, is this SDG push scenario. And what we did here is we asked ourselves with a group of experts across disciplines, what would it take to be able to not only recover, but accelerate progress towards the SDGs and the 2030 agenda. We brought together, I'll show you in a minute, this package and integrated portfolio of different development choices that could be made that could push the needle. And we found that there was a tremendous impact even beyond, as what you can see here, the no COVID baseline. This is estimating a world without COVID. What would the development trajectories have looked like? And you see the considerable benefits of this SDG push scenario. And I'll tell you a little bit more about what's in there. You also see the implications of the high damage scenario well above that for a no COVID world. And here, what I think is particularly important also for the conversation we want to have today, we're not only looking to 2030, this is taking you all the way to 2050. Why? Well, for one thing, 2030 is around the corner. For another thing, we found it was exponential and actually quite powerful and persuasive. The way that the choices made today in these most difficult years of COVID accelerate in their benefits, particularly between 2030 and 2050. This is not an easy political argument to make. The choices that you make today, those hard, difficult choices, potentially transformative choices, you'll bear the fruits of those in 2 or 3 political cycles down the road. But nonetheless, we think from the perspective of understanding and making effective policy choices today, we really need to understand this. And I'll share a couple of links with you at the end. That whole study and analysis is online. You can search for any country, a whole set of indicators aligned with the SDGs, and take a look at what that would mean for your country in those different scenarios. What we've done as well too, and I just want to pause for a moment, is that there are, of course, a number of different ways, options, and pathways to drive acceleration. And what I just wanted to share here was a couple of areas where there's particular promise and opportunity, especially for the Africa continent. This is work that UNDP is leading with a coalition of partners to understand where are there investments and opportunities that have cascade impacts. How can we make policy choices in some areas that have benefits and impact across several others? And we know that in a space of limited and shrinking financing, it's really, really important that we work together. We harness this potential of integrated analysis, and we try to pinpoint those areas that are going to have multiplier effects and cascade benefits. So this is certainly a focus for us, and you see particularly around energy, harnessing the potential of Africa's natural resource wealth, as well as opportunities for intra-African trade, have huge potential, as we've seen them, to drive not only a recovery from COVID, but accelerate progress towards the SDGs. But we are in an incredibly challenging situation as a result of vaccine injustice and vaccine equity. We at UNDP have put together with our colleagues from the World Health Organization and the University of Oxford a dashboard. And what we've tried to do in this dashboard is combine as many different data sets and information points to help us understand the socioeconomic implications of COVID. So we are fully seized of the health implications. What does that mean to a country's economy? What does that mean to levels of well-being for people within those countries? And how can we create an evidence base and allow anyone in the world, this is all openly available to source, to search and explore, and help make the case for what is required for recovery in their context. But what we find, certainly, you can see here, of course, this is progress over time. When we launched the dashboard in August, we were looking at low-income country vaccinations. It was around 1.2%, and we're at 7.46%. But still, the implications of this low and very slow vaccination rate directly affects economic and other aspects of socioeconomic recovery from COVID. I won't spend too much time here, but again, what I think is quite important is that every opportunity that we can, we bring the data, we understand together, we analyze with multiple groups of experts. So the coalition, the partnerships are really important. What are we seeing? What does this mean in a particular context? How do we take action? And we will know that there are always multiple options and pathways, but how do we present these insights in such a way that the choices can be made that are most effective and most meaningful for certain people in certain areas of the world? So a very tailored approach. So what we find here in terms of the economic recovery forecast is that we have seen and would expect to see for high income countries, even middle income countries, this U-shaped recovery, which many are talking about. And this is pulling from the World Economic outlook reports, and we're looking at where their estimates lie over a couple of different reporting periods. And you see them from April and October of last year to April and October of this year. And the point that I just wanted to share is just how concerning the stagnated, the contracting space for low income, low middle income countries in terms of their prospects for economic recovery. We work very closely, as I mentioned, with our colleagues at World Health Organization in this dashboard and in trying to make as visual and accessible as possible the implications across different development spheres, this challenge of vaccine injustice. And really what's quite critical, and this is analysis that you can play through this yourself on the vaccine equity dashboard, is this challenge of speed. When we aren't able to vaccinate populations quickly, it has tremendous implications on economic and other aspects of social well-being. And that may be obvious, but we want to put numbers and we want to be able to look at the differences across different types of countries, different regions, et cetera. So when we look at this target of vaccinating 40% of the adult population by December 2021, we see that there's 36 countries that would need to double their vaccination rates on a weekly basis to meet that target. And for several other countries, for 16 other countries, we would need significant focused, targeted global cooperation to ensure that the doses are available to them so that they were able to reach that 40% target in the first place. This has a series of implications, and I hope we can get into this discussion in terms of context within different countries, the challenges of supply chains, the challenges of different populations and their needs, particularly those that have historically been marginalized. It is absolutely the place that we need to focus our conversations and ensure that we're able to make progress in vaccinating populations. But at this point, we feel it remains an incredible challenge in terms of access alone and affordability alone of vaccines. And until we can get these challenges resolved, it's very difficult to move towards the conversations we need to have, which is how we tailor and ensure that all people in all countries, preferably in a way that meets the ambition of the 2030 agenda, that we're reaching the furthest behind first, that is a reality in our vaccination strategies. I'm going to leave it at this. I hope that's useful in giving you a sense of not only what where I see some of the potential areas for acceleration, but frankly, how we want to approach both COVID recovery and making progress, accelerating progress towards the SDGs. And that is with a much more robust and creative evidence base using different types of data. It's absolutely working with different types of partners and people in different contexts. It's from a perspective of providing options, pathways, considerations, implications, and working with people fundamentally on the financing that needs to underpin this, to be able to move from knowing that we need to change, knowing that transformation is not fixing what's broken in systems, but that bridge that we need to cross to be able to act. And I hope certainly that this sparks a conversation among many of us, but also that this is something that helps us recover better and move forward in a very intentional way from the current state that we're facing, particularly for the challenges of the Africa region. So Alex, I'll leave it at that. I hope I haven't gone over too far. Back to you.
Not at all. Absolutely perfect timing, great slides, and plenty for us to think about. I was particularly taken with one of your concluding really important observations about the need for robust and creative evidence base for what we decide and how we work together and partner in terms of responding to this COVID pandemic and building a more sustainable future. So thank you very much, Laurel, for that. I just want to remind people who have joined us slightly late that this meeting is fully on the record. So you can report everything you said, everything Laurel said is absolutely able to be quoted and cited and cross-examined. And also a reminder that if you are joining us and prefer to listen to this conversation in French, if you're on the Zoom platform, we have simultaneous translation. So just click on the interpretation button and you will hear me in French rather than English. So please do that if you'd like to do that. So we have two more panelists. So we've only just started and there's plenty of time. So I'm now going to go over to and introduce Hannah Ryder, who is the CEO of Development Reimagined, a pioneering African-owned international development consultancy with headquarters in China and offices in Kenya and the UK. Hannah's a former diplomat and economist with 20 years of experience. She is also a senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, and a member of the UAE's International Advisory Council on the New Economy. Hannah is actually in Dakar at the moment, so I guess she was attending the FOCAC ministerial that's just finished. So, and I know that she's leaving Dakar this evening. But Hannah, welcome, and I hand over to you. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much to Chatham House for the invitation to be here today. It's wonderful to get the opportunity to discuss these issues, think about what post-pandemic recovery, whenever we get there, actually looks like and what we might want from as an African continent from that. I'm as you just mentioned, Alex, I'm in Dakar, where we've just concluded the China-Africa ministerial. I'm happy to take some questions on that from the audience a bit later, but bear in mind that my remarks here will be focusing on a broader level, not specifically China, although I will bring that in simply because we do have expertise in that area. But of course, as I said, happy to also mention that. Look, I think what I wanted to bring out today perhaps was on a more, perhaps on some observations on a political level, but also some practical proposals. I think in terms of thinking about COVID-19 recovery and what it means for Africa and African partnerships, I think we have to start from two observations, and I'd say, and also four practical proposals. In terms of the observations, there is no doubt that the COVID-19 crisis has exposed Africa's vulnerabilities. Now, most of us, Chatham House itself wouldn't exist if those of us in this room didn't want the world to be a better place. UN wouldn't. But the fact is that the structures that we have are clearly not fit for purpose. And we knew this before COVID-19, and we've seen it as COVID-19 continues. I used to be a climate change negotiator. I can attest to the numbers of sleepless nights spent by negotiators trying to move ahead, and we saw that at COP26. But even with COP26, we're still not doing what our children demand from us. The World Trade Organization, arguably the strongest international legal mechanism that there is, has been unable to drive trade to Africa above 4% of the global total. All of the aid for trade schemes have still also not done the same. At the same time, we're seeing a supply chain crisis and the US-China trade war having a major impact on across the world, including in African countries. And then in the aid world, loans, even from China, however large people think they are, there's still not been enough to build the needed infrastructure in African countries and beyond. At the same time, the IMF classifies primarily African countries as debt distressed. And when it comes to COVID-19, we've had donors who are collectively spending billions of dollars on health, but have hardly been the driver for any success so far in the COVID-19 fight. And in reality, as Laura's talk was mentioning, really driving it back through domestic decisions rather than international decisions. So there are a number of vulnerabilities which I think we have to be very, which we really need to rethink partnerships as a result. At the same time, and this is my second point, we also have some important opportunities. With COVID-19, we had an opportunity to see what the world looks like without very large power and transport emissions. We've had an opportunity to see the success of African and Asian governments in managing COVID-19 with new eyes and wondering, well, actually, have investors, credit rating agencies got assessments wrong? when they think about foreign direct investment in African countries or in Asian countries even. Do we need, in terms of, for example, the global health system, there's an opportunity to think about how do we orient our big vertical public funds towards system strengthening? And what does that really look like? How to invest in aid for vaccines without sacrificing the poverty focus? That's another question. And then, you know, a number of areas, infrastructure again is still really necessary. How do we start to focus on digital tools in investment in digital infrastructure to deliver not just more trade, but also, for example, more education? And how do we even use microfinance, for example, to inform our multilateral discussions about debt? And what opportunities does China offer if it is going to invest in African economies? I'd say overall, in terms of what we have with COVID-19 epidemic, we have as difficult a time as we have an exciting time, an opportunity for significant change. So I think we have to see partnerships in that light. We have to see partnerships in the light of the challenges that they have exposed, as well as the opportunities that they can provide. And in that context, we have to then think about, what does equal partnership mean? What do reimagined partnerships for African countries mean? And here I want to propose 4 ideas to underlie real partnership. And I'm going to frame them in terms of what real partnership does and what it doesn't do as well. So I think the first aspect is to think about partnership based on an understanding of African perspectives. As an example, what is, and since Chatham House is based in the UK, what is the UK to Africa? Obviously, that differs hugely across the continent. Africa is not one country, but overall, UK is Africa's 3rd largest source of foreign direct investment stocks, which means it's ahead of the US. But that foreign direct investment goes mostly into extractives. The UK is just larger than China in terms of aid flows, but that's declining, especially with a 0.5, and also has fairly low imports of African products, but a fairly decent percentage of those are processed. There are high barriers to entry to the UK, even for students, and so it counts for less than 1/5 of those going to China. And professionals, and with COVID-19, we've had the red list. We have a new red list, which has exposed a great deal of racism underneath that, and it's making it worse. There's less tourists from the UK than China, US, or France to African countries. Nevertheless, the UK is fairly trusted through in particular through civil society in terms of governance and institutions. So that perspective, I think in the development world, it's hardly discussed. But once you start to look at what does a partner for Africa look like, what does the UN look like from African eyes, I think it's very, very useful to inform what real partnership could deliver. Second, real partnership needs to be responsive to demands, needs, and ambitions, grappling with problems in African countries, but also frameworks, and also, as I said, ambitions. Very, very important. In development language, this is called country ownership, localizing development, decolonizing development, also respecting sovereignty of these countries, like no conditionality, and so on. But I think it's even more fundamental than that. It's really important to get away from embedding in our imaginations an indefinite rich world versus poor Africa. Take the example of Africa Agenda 2063, which envisions Africa as a continent as the 3rd largest economy in the world. I won't say who would be the first and the second, but also the world's largest manufacturing hub. But how does that happen with the recent agreements on green development, how is that precedent really going to be established for being a green manufacturing hub? Vaccine manufacturing in African countries, the world has clearly shown that it's not responsive to African needs. And there is a big push now for local manufacturing of vaccines and other medical equipment. But the reality is that's been a plan for a very, very long time. The problem is procurement models have really stopped that working so far. So there are a number of solutions which are often proposed in development, but quite often they're not necessarily responsive to the demands and the ambitions of African countries or generally the poorest within African countries. I would also mention the idea of private sector leveraging can also be very challenging, because for close to half of African countries do not have credit ratings. So it's very difficult for them to access city finance. So it's really how do we engage with providing public finance, and in that way, if we focus on looking at public finance, that will provide more responsiveness. So I'm just giving some examples to think through to help try to understand what responsiveness really means. The second, the third, is the third principle of partnership, and what partnership in an SDG era should really try to focus in a post-COVID SDG era, is to really ensure agency. It's not really about, it's very important to avoid imposing values and to avoid, and not just, it's not really just about doing no harm. It really goes beyond that. It needs to recognize that in many cases, and as I'd mentioned earlier, the rules-based system is not really working for the great majority of countries, and COVID-19 has really exposed that. But it's really about saying, okay, as a partner to African countries or a African country, how can UN organizations, how can China, how can the UK, how can our own systems change rather than consistently and always making the African side work? So it's about ensuring that everybody is working together. It's not really, or changing together, structurally changing together, not just one partner having to constantly change. I think trade schemes are one of the most important examples of that, where quite often for aid for trade schemes, the big onus is on, changing customs, making customs more efficient, etc. But there's hardly anything done on the side of the importer, who tend to be the richer countries, to actually make reduce barriers of non-tariff barriers and so on. So that's what I mean about equal partnership, equalizing agency. And last but not least, I think what does partnership mean in the SDG post-COVID era is really about having humility, avoiding arrogance, having more trust, having more respect, remembering that particularly in African countries and all countries, accountability of governments is ultimately to their citizens, and accountability to donors and accountability to the multilateral system can actually undermine that. So it's very important to really enable accountability, and by stepping away and enabling that agency and encouraging a sense of much more trust and respect. And I think these are all lessons that we've learned from COVID-19 and can be taken forward into our partnerships in future. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. And so just to emphasize, Hannah was really emphasizing the importance of real partnership, and she deconstructed that into African perspectives, how to be responsive, and then really about agency and humility, and very helpful to continue this conversation. So let me go to our final panelist before we then have a bit of a discussion. And so I'm in Nairobi, so joining me here in the same city is Florence Sebu, who is the country coordinator for SDGs Kenya Forum, which is an inclusive membership platform on Agenda 2030 that provides space for the structural and coordinated engagement of civil society organizations with national and subnational governments, citizens, the private sector, media, academia, and development partners. Prior to that, Florence held the role as national coordinator at the Global Call to Action Against Poverty Kenya. So Florence, thank you very much for joining us today. And I hand over to you. I look forward to hearing your observations. Florence, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Alex, and to Chatham House for this invitation. As introduced, my name is Florence Yebo. It's a great pleasure to join you all the way from Nairobi, Kenya. And I'll be sharing with you maybe just some few slides as I make my presentation this afternoon. It's just a minute, I'm trying to share. Okay, there. And so, for us, I think it's a great pleasure to join this conversation on policy for recovery in Africa. It's a great conversation because for example, just giving our perspectives here in Nairobi or here in Kenya. And it's great to see that the comments or just the presentation from Laurel, Anna, they've been very rich in terms of how do we look at policies and how do we look also at partnerships at country level, but also at global space. And so I'll go straight in to just give a few perceptions that I thought about this afternoon. And so the first thing is, of course, for us here at country level, and I think it's very good to get this opportunity to really showcase what really is going on at country level and maybe some of the thinking processes that are going at national level. And so for us, for example, the principle of seeking partnerships within the COVID-19 pandemic in the context of SDGs is to improve national public participation system. Because for us, public participation, how to ensure that we can capture views of the citizen is quite very important. Also to ensure access to information, like on issues of vaccination, and so forth. Also issues of justice in decision making. There's been a lot that has come out during the COVID, as most of you know, and especially for developing countries. Issues like gender-based violence, things like, just children not being able to go to school or access, formal education and so forth. And also issues of that affect socioeconomic, environmental, and political well-being of a nation. And so how do we improve public access to information, participation, and also decision-making, issues of justice in decision-making to make it, we can ensure that there's more fairness, legitimate, and also sustainable decisions that can impact both the citizen, but also country level. And so I wanted to just talk about two key partnerships that we are pursuing here in Kenya that have really helped us from the civil society organizations to be able, one, to have our voices heard, but two, also to be part and parcel of this conversation and also to contribute effectively. And so one of the things that the SDG Kenya Forum is part of is the Interagency Technical Working Committee on SDGs, which is the highest decision-making organ here in Kenya, and it's a multi-stakeholder platform that brings together the government ministries, departments and agencies, the Subnational Council of Governors, private sector under the Kenya Private Sector Alliance, Parliamentary Caucus, other UN bodies, and also development partners, national, the youth, different youth councils, but also academia. And so why I thought this would be very good to showcase is the kind of activities that we've been able to carry since, of course, under this particular umbrella during the COVID pandemic, and of course, having this mandate where rolling out of SDG activities and the technical backstopping happens within this particular committee. And so, of course, having this platform initially before COVID, because this was launched in 2016, has enabled that the different stakeholders, so like we could understand what's really happening in businesses, like private sector, what are the challenges being experienced by private sector, we from civil society, and the issues of leaving no one behind, how citizens maybe have been impacted within issues of losing, their jobs, and how that is impacting livelihoods and the different SDGs and so forth. And so this has been a very, very great maybe partnership platform that I thought would be very good to share and to showcase that once we have a multi-stakeholder kind of partnerships, we are able to sort of utilize them even when there are issues like this pandemic that has really disrupted country implementation on sustainable development. And so a lot of things have happened in there in terms of service delivery, in terms of policy, advocacy, but also policy just reviews. And so for us, these great stories that have really, really come forward in terms of the partnership that is there at country level and the opportunities that, for example, the national government has to continuously speak to all of us to sort of just get policy briefs or advice or what is really going on at country level. And of course, there's been a lot of both positive interventions, but also the calling out of maybe whatever that could be going on at country level that is not very positive. Moving on, one of the things that also we have taken up here in Kenya within the civil society platform is an annual partnership with the media, one of the media houses. And the reason why I felt that this was important is just because I'm sure most of you all we know the role of media and how important this is, and especially in the context of a developing country. And so for us, media has always been very far-fetched idea, because a lot of national organizations or country or even local-based organizations are not able to afford media services in terms of the partnership. And so for us, coming up with a memorandum of understanding whereby we can have annual working model. And this means we are showcasing SDG implementation processes, the monitoring and review, and more importantly, just showcasing the stories, if it's on COVID-19, what really is happening, because many times a lot of the stories or a lot of the realities do not make it to the media, as you all know, or do not make it to the public. And so for us, there's been a lot on like gender-based violence, as mentioned before. There's been a lot on marginalized population or communities and the kind of impact they are experiencing, and how COVID-19 has really, really disrupted people's livelihoods, but also ongoing projects. And so it's really been great to see this kind of, just how to channel some of this to the media. And the model also speaks about utilizing or enriching content that already exists, and also coming up with mainstream content that could be showcased at mainstream, but tailored to SDG, COVID-19 interventions, and how the decade of action, what needs to really happen during the decade of action. And so for us, looking at the remaining about 8 years, of course, there's a great concern that even with the, of course, the alignment of SDGs, but also of the Agenda 2063, which has a bigger lifespan than the SDGs, and how can we sort of align these both agendas at national level, but ensure that now the issues of COVID-19 recovery strategies can really be covered, and we can ensure that conversations and priorities in terms of policy, priorities in terms of budget, allocation can really happen at country level, and we can see tangible results, both at national and sub-national governments. So I'll end with this last slide in terms of the challenges, and I know a lot has been spoken by previous speakers, but for us, I thought that it would be important to highlight these three challenges. And one is, of course, the vaccine injustice. I will not maybe get into a lot of details because Laurel really spoke about this. And for us, I think for me, it's just to highlight vaccine injustice in the midst of poor health systems has really been a nightmare. And of course, issues of access, storage of vaccines. We have villages, or we have places, many places in Africa where, of course, storage of vaccine has been a nightmare. and also even just the choice of vaccine, because of course, many times or many people have always had to use or take whatever vaccines that are available. And so there's been a lot of challenges around the vaccine access, vaccine administration, and so many other underlying health conditions or challenges, and especially among poor communities where people for many years cannot access just basic health systems. And so now you're asking, people are now wanting to get vaccinated, and yet some of them have underlying conditions that they've never known about. And we've seen cases and challenges where people have, lost their lives or gotten into very, very serious health challenges just because some of these underlying conditions for many have never been diagnosed, or they've never gotten to know. And then the second one is, of course, on the slow economic growth due to lockdowns. And I know this has happened not just in Kenya or Africa, but also for the world over. And of course, this has also really affected resource allocation, both at the global, regional, and national level. And for us, for example, as civil society organizations, we have a lot of organizations that are closing down because, of course, they are not able to access funding. And for us, for many developing countries, our work is supported by a lot of donor funding. And again, this also is not forthcoming to many organizations. And so there's a big challenge in terms of just service delivery and support to already ongoing basic services, things like education, access to water, and so forth, things that have been very, very dire and critical in terms of sustainable development. And then, of course, one of the other things that has been evident is how Africa has heavily relied on scientific and technological assistance, or we have huge existing gaps on issues of scientific and technological and innovation gaps within the continent. And so, of course, with the vaccines and the COVID-19, and of course, talking about just the kits that are required and so forth, we've seen that a lot of our governments have really had to depend on donations, have had to depend on, just good will from other countries, and yet some of this can be produced locally. And of course, the technology, the innovations have really, really been lacking. And so I think these are some of the critical questions as a continent. I think we need to pause and ask ourselves, because the manpower, of course, is there, but maybe just having some of these functional, processes or factories or whatever, institutions that are required. Maybe that's where the challenge is, and also the financing of this. And so I'll stop there and I'll maybe pass it on to Alex. Thank you very much for listening. And I hope that we could continue this conversation. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Florence. So a really important takeaway I took from your presentation is the importance of a really legitimate multi-stakeholder initiative, both at national and county level in terms of Kenya. And what it tells to me, which of course, we have tremendous variety in 54, 55 African states, is the importance of subnational politics and processes. And of course, there, Kenya, which had the county system introduced some years ago, has some interesting learning in terms of local level accountability and decentralization. And you did kind of go full circle, Florence, and end up talking again what Laurel did right at the end about the real importance of robust and creative evidence bases for the policies that we need for partnerships for sustainable development. So thank you very much for that. Now, what's going to happen now is that I'm just going to have a brief conversation with our three panelists, because there was kind of one overarching question that came to my mind listening to all three. And then we're going to turn to you, the audience, if you're on Zoom. Again, my apologies for those of you who are on Facebook Live. We're just not able to take questions. But if you're on Zoom, either put your question in the Q&A. We have disabled the chat function, but the Q&A function is open. So put your question there, or raise your hand and we'll come to you. We've still got reasonable time, so don't panic. There's plenty of time for a conversation. So what I'm going to do is Laurel, Hannah, and Florence, I'm asking you the same question, basically, which is this year, we had multilateral fora. We had the G7 and the G20. Yeah. So the UK G7, Italy's presidency of the G20. So that's a multilateral. We had bilateral initiatives. You had the French Africa Summit. Hannah, you've just been at the FOCAC, ministerial. We've got maybe next week the 5th South Korea Africa Forum, if it isn't cancelled. We certainly have the Turkey Africa Summit on the 17th of December. And then next year, we have the EU Africa one in the first quarter. We have a UK Africa Investment Summit, number 2. We have the Russia Africa Summit, India Africa Forum, and I could go on, and I could go on, and I could go on. So the question to all of you is, how do these big summitories help partnerships for sustainable development? You know, we're talking about vaccine inequality, we're talking about debt and debt suspension and in fact, debt cancellation potentially. And how do they help in terms of getting these growth patterns? I'm asking this obviously because Chatham House is also the Royal Institute of International Affairs. So looking at in that kind of round. So Laurel, you're in New York, you've got the UN just there. You look at this stuff. Are these things useful or are they just talk shops? How can they help us get partnerships for sustainable development?
Alex, thanks. It's a great question. And I'll be curious for Hannah and Florence's perspectives as well too. Look, I think the challenge with some of these summits and high-level dialogues and so on is the pathways to action, what comes out of them. And that's very difficult. And one of the concerns for me is that we run the risk of being caught in our narratives. We run the risk of being caught in a rhetoric that we aren't able to action meaningfully. We like to say it's a window of opportunity. We like to say the time is now. We've always said that, Alex. This is the thing. It's not only specific to COVID that we feel that way. We often collectively share this sense that something needs to change now. And if we don't capitalize on windows, which are very real, they close, which they do. So to me, the challenge for us becomes, how do we take those opportunities for people to come together, which are incredibly important, especially in COVID, when everyone has been more disconnected and separated in screens. How do you make the most of those opportunities to come together to drive action? And to me, a couple of things that I would reflect on that we've seen over the course of this year that I think are important going into next year is the need to understand the intersections and the interdependencies between these issues and challenges. We say we want a systems lens. We say the 2030 agenda is a systems agenda. It's the first globally agreed systems agenda. It is universal and it's indivisible. But we tend to move issues in different pieces, in different sectors, in different silos. So to me, the big challenge for us on the UN side, having the common agenda now launched and led, giving us this, a very empowering vision of the future. How are we connecting the actions coming out of Glasgow? How are we connecting the actions to propel progress on the SDGs? How are we propelling action through the Sendai framework? How do these come together and how are they mutually reinforcing? So that's where I think there's a real opportunity for us to explore. And that's where I think a data and evidence base brought into these collaborative opportunities are really, really important. So that we look not only at that, whatever is immediately the issue and the topic of that particular summit or opportunity, but what are the connecting interdependencies and variables and opportunities which will impact the way that we can action successfully or not, certain agreements that are made. So my plea is, as we move into these, we do all what we can to identify the actions, right? And so the collaborations are not only valuable in those summits and sessions, but they have a track, they have a runway where those commitments translate much more quickly than they do right now into action. And that has to be something that for countries and subnational populations, exactly the way that Florence was describing it, these are key stakeholders. These are summits and conversations that matter for them. So I do think, in addition to what I'm describing as the evidence and the interdependency, looking at the interdependency across issues is also to ask ourselves, who is in the room and what does that reflect in terms of predominant power hierarchies? What would it take? Who else? Who are we not hearing? Who else needs to be in this room speaking directly, not on behalf of? And then I think, those are adjustments in the way that we normally run a lot of these international summits and so on. There's efforts always that are made to do this. I think we can do more.
Thank you very much. Well, Hannah, you've just sat through one of these ministerial summits. You look still upbeat and positive. So what's your perspective on this? And was there humility? Was there true partnership? Was there agency? All the things that you were talking about. Did you see that in Dakar? Or did you see bits of it?
I'd say I saw some of it. I think there's definitely still a long way to go. But on the other hand, I think what we've seen with this summit and some of the preparatory work that went into it, for example, is much more of an African-led agenda. And I'll tell you how that's been achieved. So one of the things that we did as a firm in advance of the summit was to look at how does the support from China so far, there's lots of numbers, they're all very impressive because they're very big. How do those actually link into Africa Agenda 2063 and by extension, the African SDGs? And using those as effectively a benchmark for what any partner for Africa should do, right? So there is Agenda 2063. It's got 6 frameworks which cover everything from mining to the environment to trade, and then there's 15 flagship projects. Many people don't use these or use them even in the analysis of what should be done in terms of development partnerships, but they're fundamental. These are the things that have been agreed by African governments collectively through the AU process. And so they represent effectively the best aspiration of African agency there is. So and what we've seen in the Chinese process is prior to this, there were only 2 of those frameworks that had been recognized in the China-Africa Summit. So then it was the agriculture program and the trade, the free trade area progress. But this time we've had all 6 of them referred to. There's much more emphasis on using the infrastructure program, for example. And again, linking to the trade, the free trade area, which has just been, which is now operational. So we do see that progress, but nevertheless, of course, each donor, each country, each partner will still want to come up with their own ideas where they think that they can make where they can really make a difference, where they can really excel. So I think it's really about that process, and I do believe that we've seen that through FOCAC. It's I think there's been more progress. And I would say that going forwards, to answer your question, I think that's what I think that's required for every single partnership. It's very important for African countries and African stakeholders, governments, to really benchmark any support from any partner against those needs, against the SDGs. For African countries, collectively, in order to meet the SDGs, even forget what COVID-19 has done in terms of the economic recovery, making that even worse, because of the decline of tourism, the decline of a number of revenues that countries really rely on. African countries would have had to reduce poverty at twice the rate of China. And we think China has reduced poverty at a very fast clip. So imagine doing that. It's a very, very serious endeavor. And I think half of the time we're also not really thinking just how serious and kind of to scale that meeting the SDGs really is for African countries. We're taking it very slowly and kind of step by step. We can't be. And we really need to think much bigger. And I would say Africa, the Agenda 2063, the detailed documents under Agenda 2063 are the right place to start.
Thank you, Hannah. I'm trying to turn my video on. It did strike me when you're telling me, I mean, you know, the graphs, even before COVID, was that poverty reduction flatlines in Africa. It's declining everywhere else, and how urgent this absolutely is. And I was in Blantyre, Malawi, a couple of weeks ago, and there'd just been a riot there. And so people were rioting there. There'd been tear gas on the streets. I talked to youth, and they were saying, well, you know, we're suffering from inflation. Where are the jobs? And they were blaming President Chakwera, including that they said, oh, he's just traveling to these international summits, and he's just been to COP26 in Glasgow, and now he's just been in Durban. He's forgotten us. And that's you know, he's still in a honeymoon period. So it just goes to show the pressures that African leadership have from local level, because people are really suffering because of the economic headwinds created by commodity fluctuations, but the pandemic. And so that's the question I really want to turn to Florence, which is, Florence, you know, these international initiatives and these summits and everything, I mean, you're working at county level and at local level. You know, I mean, how do what happens at the international macro level in terms of pushing big longer term agendas, how do you transform that into kind of action on the ground at the local level in the way that you're trying to do?
Thank you very much, Alex. And yes, I agree that, of course, there's a lot that goes on at international level and also regional level that many times most of us at country level or at subnational level really hardly can see or struggle to even understand why some of these meetings that maybe are very, very costly and of course bring a lot of, just very high level delegations and so forth. And sometimes even some of the some of our governments are very, very involved with very huge delegations. And of course, we don't see the translation in terms of in terms of the frequency and the decisions and the outcomes that come from these meetings. Of course, I'm not saying that nothing ever comes out of these meetings, but of course, I think my comment here is more about just what really is a vision and how can we track some of the impact of some of these international convenings. And so I just want to quote a recent analysis or study that was done that the SDG Forum and some of our partners here in Kenya. And it was about just before the pandemic, of course, there were concerns raised about ability of countries around the world meeting the targets of the Agenda 2030, especially because of financing. And so I think it was evident in less than 120 days, governments were able to raise an amount of, $20.4 trillion to sort of deal with COVID-19. And yet, when you look at the SDG funding deficit, as always, annually stood at $3 trillion per annum. And so for us, just wondering how in 120 days it was possible to have, $20.4 trillion, and yet annually just 3.3 trillion is always a deficit among governments and so forth. And so, of course, now there was availability of $10 trillion in terms of funding to COVID-19 economic stimulus. And so I think for us, it's just asking this kind of questions, and this showcases to us that, of course, the reality is very, very different. It's not about resources are not available. It's more about maybe how some of these convenings are structured. And for me, I think it's to advance certain interests or partnerships among those that are involved. And you see, if it's G7, it's 7. If it's 20, it's about maybe 20 countries involved and so forth. And so a lot of times this, of course, never speaks to reality on the ground and to reality about what really is happening, and especially among poor countries and in Africa especially. And so I think we need to be really, really honest. And I think we are at a point where we cannot just keep speaking about the same things year in, year out. It's time to really, if there's no interest in funding some of this, it needs to be very, very clear. And of course, domestic financing is a whole other topic, and a lot of governments, of course, are struggling with that because of the structural, structures that exist at country level. And so how do we, for example, build capacity for national, of course, governments, and of course, they have transition queries and some issues of corruption, and others, it's more about, countries that economically maybe are not at par with others. And so the issues of distribution of wealth and so forth. And so I think it's a huge debate, and we need to be very, very practical about it, but also institutions at higher level and within this G7, G20 and many others, there needs to be practical solutions. Otherwise, in my opinion, then some of these meetings may not be very relevant if we do not have tangible results. Thank you very much. And sorry for my radical remarks.
No, not radical at all. You were basically saying you need to drive action. You need action, no, less words and more action, tangibles. So we do have questions coming in, which is great. And so I'm now going to invite a number of people if they want to ask the question verbally, otherwise I'll read them out. But the first person is Olalekan Ojumu. We're going to invite you to ask your question live. So we're going to unmute you. So please go ahead and ask your question if you're still with us. Otherwise, I will read your question out. Some people have, a few people have dropped off already. Okay, so I'm going to read the question, which is to the panelists. With the weakening of political institutions in Africa, do you think it is possible for African countries to pass viable policies that will trigger recoveries and promote sustainable development? So this is one about basically governance and institutions. Maybe I'll go to you, Hannah, first on this one, if you'd like to try and answer that question.
Sure, and to be honest, I think I'd like to challenge the question a little bit, because
go ahead.
I'm curious as to what weakening of African political institutions means, because I think what we've seen with COVID-19 is that actually African governments were very responsive, very quick to understand what COVID-19 management required, coordinated that process with each other through the Africa CDC, and in terms of economic recovery, have tried to spend a great deal. By September 2020, African governments had spent 2.5% of GDP, or collectively about $68 billion on the COVID-19 response. That's not just health spending, but also helping citizens to cash transfers in Egypt. In total, our calculations suggest that they managed to reach 175, the different measures that were brought in reached 175 million people. So I don't think we should kind of say that African governments are not responsive. At the same time, with this kind of challenge and the extreme economic challenges that have, and continuing economic challenges, and especially because of restrictions on travel, because of lack of vaccines, etc., air freight and so on, passenger flights not even moving. Of course, then economic recovery is constrained and African governments are facing fiscal challenges. So that is making a big issue. That's creating even more issues. It is constraining their ability to respond. And so I think what's really important is and of course, every government can do better for its citizens, there is no doubt, but so can the UK government, so can the American government. These are issues which arise in every single society. So I think we need to see, and because African governments have such constraints on their finance, how can the international system help them to become less constrained so that they can be more responsive to their citizens' needs, especially for a prolonged problem like COVID-19 is creating. So that would be my challenge. I wouldn't say that there's weakened institutions necessarily.
Thank you very much, Hannah. We have another questioner who is Charles Mutasa. So Charles, we're going to unmute you and do ask your questions. I think there were two from you, and do indicate who you want to ask the question to. Thank you very much, Charles.
Thanks. Right. My two questions were, first, it was on the issue of the vaccination uptake rates. I would be happy if maybe Rorel from UNDP could try to tackle this one. My reading is that the uptake of vaccination has been a problem, not only in Africa, but worldwide. People are not really keen to be vaccinated. I have been, talking to a number of people. I think even in New York, you could check yourself whether people are really taking up vaccinations. But then the question is, have you done an analysis of how this resistance to vaccination, because this is mostly based on people, these are things pertaining to human rights. It's a right to be vaccinated or not. And how does that really trigger into your analysis? Because when you talk about Africa, it looks like it is Africa that is the highest resistance of vaccination. Is that true? Has there been an analysis of whether people in Europe or Africa who is going for an uptake of vaccinations? I'm aware of factors like the dislike of the types of vaccine and other, logistics. But the question is, has there been an analysis of the rate of uptake between the continents and how that has affected even our talk about sustainable development? And secondly, the issue of the new variant. There has been a ban on the flights from certain parts of Africa, particularly Southern Africa. And the question that remains is this scientific? We saw that there was Delta at some point. There was not a quick ban of flights to those areas that were showing signs of Delta virus and so on. And my comment is this scientific or a source of true partnership, or it's a xenophobic approach to the whole issue of COVID-19? Thanks.
All right, Laurel, over to you for answering those questions.
Charles, thank you. I think first of all, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, vaccination uptake is not only an issue of access and affordability, but frankly, without access and affordability, it's difficult to understand what the constraining factors are in certain countries. Why? Because there's no vaccines. So to me, what we're starting to see as vaccines are arriving in countries, this is sparking a set of debates exactly as you're describing them, Charles, where people are saying, I would have a vaccine, but I don't want that one. I want an mRNA technology like they have in the United States or Canada or something like this. I don't want X, Y, or Z vaccine. There are questions that are more logistical related to how you reach certain populations. There's challenges of misinformation, which have to be tackled together with this topic as well too. Fundamentally, there's a real challenge of trust. And for certain segments of a population, particularly segments that have been historically marginalized, those are the least willing to come forward to be vaccinated. And we see the same thing in the United States. Now, we're learning a lot also from the United States. I mean, Canada has, which is where I'm from, has also made significant efforts to understand and reach populations which are which may be more reluctant, which may be historically marginalized for different reasons. And there's been some very interesting studies that have been done and outreaches which has been targeted at indigenous populations in America, which are particularly reluctant to be vaccinated because of a historic lack of trust in the government institutions. So while we're learning, I would say at this point, I don't think there's any study. There's probably several studies, but I think they tend to be focused on particular countries and the particular challenges that they're facing in terms of understanding what is preventing vaccination uptake. But my sense, Charles, is that this is the conversation that we need to have. And this is what will prevent, even when access and affordability are online. And I don't want us to lose the emphasis on access and affordability because countries don't have what they need right now. But so that's for sure. But at the same time, we need to start understanding with a much higher level of granularity, what are the barriers and considerations? Where do dialogues and information campaigns, where do other efforts at reconciliation, frankly, need to be put in place, because those will be the barriers to vaccination. So I'd be happy to share afterwards. There's certainly some interesting studies. Another thing on our mind, thinking about some of the, well, I mean, Alex, you referred to it as a protest that took place in Malawi. We certainly saw different levels of social instability which took place in South Africa recently. So one of the things that we are trying to map and understand with partners is the connection between social instability and vaccination rates. And maybe the one point, if it's okay, Alex, that I wanted to make to what Hannah's response earlier, which I completely agree with in terms of political institutions in Africa, I would say we one of the things we do have to focus on is jobs, and ensuring that the economic recovery from COVID is not a jobless recovery. Some of the analysis that we did found that the jobless rate as a result of the pandemic is 5 times higher than it was in the 2008 financial crisis. And that's particularly a challenge for countries that have high levels of informal economy workers. Those tend not to be prioritized for vaccines, or sometimes they show up on the lower end of a priority group. But these are the populations that are also particularly affected by lockdowns, where there aren't other mechanisms in place to manage different outbreaks. So I really would want to encourage us to think about an economic recovery which promotes and creates jobs, and to think particularly about vulnerabilities that exist within informal economy sectors. And that in the African context as well is particularly the case for women in those sectors. These are things we need to take side of. This is not to say that our position would be that everything should be made formal, not at all. But we do need to protect and ensure that those populations are well understood and are supported as we recover from COVID. So Charles, I realize that's only a partial answer, and I don't have it. Frankly, in terms of what it would take and what is the connection between a sort of a levels of human rights and a willingness for populations to be vaccinated. But I really believe this is where we need to concentrate our collective effort. The last thing I would say, I'm not sure that we're going to see this in the data. Certainly not in socioeconomic data. It lags for different reasons. Here's where I would make a pitch and a plea for qualitative data, for stories and insights and lessons which we can categorize, tag, and apply as actionable intelligence in different contexts. But this is where I think the sharing and collaboration is really going to be key. Over.
Thank you very much, Laurel. So we have another questioner. I think we have given you permission to be unmuted. So Tio Beale, you had a question for Hannah. You've been very patient. So Tio, please go ahead.
Hiya, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
So yes, it was a bit of an annoying crystal ball question for Hannah on what might or could happen in the short to medium term for the Aid for Trade initiative. I guess part of the debate of whether it's really represents aid in the altruistic sense, but rather, does she think there's any meaningful change that can happen to donor practices in the space that can improve the trade conditions for recipients? If so, what? And also, if it isn't fit for purpose, is China Belt and Road just going to trigger moves away from aid donorship through these official channels, inverted commas, and sort of discussion of what the inherent risks of that are? Thanks.
Great. Hannah, crystal ball. I hope you still don't regret joining this conversation today. Go ahead.
Not at all. So this morning, in fact, I was on a call talking about something called global public investment, which is a concept that a good friend of mine, Jonathan Glennie, has been working on and kind of advocating for. But some of us are engaging in order to kind of try and cement what does it really mean. And I think I'm mentioning that because one of the things that Jonathan always says, and I think most of us who engage with that topic always say, is that there is always going to be a need for public finance, and including grant finance, which is then what aid is. Even in the idea of kind of universal SDGs, when we get to this sort of mecca of no extreme poverty in the world, we will still have unequal parts of society, sadly, most likely, that we need to provide global public goods for, and domestic public goods for. So I don't think, I wouldn't say that there should be a shift away from ODA. At the same time, at the same time, I do think it is important to still really think about how effective ODA programs can be aid for trade, I do believe, can be much more effective if there are complementary measures on the importers' side to adjust their own trading system. That will make a considerable difference, and that will make a considerable difference to their effectiveness. But again, similarly, on the foreign direct investment side, it is not just a case of investment of countries changing their own investment climate and their business climate. I think, again, far too much focus, and especially as a result of the World Bank's Doing Business Index, has been really on, how can countries change their investment climate? We also need to have an equal, if not more important focus on how do investors change their perceptions, risk perceptions of African economies. And I think really working on how that can be done, creating more structures and mechanisms to overcome those sorts of risk perceptions is going to be really important going forwards. So I think all of the finance flows are very, very important. Aid, loans, and foreign direct investment, and we should work on all of them consistently and try and make them as effective as possible.
Great, thank you very much. So we've got a hand that is up. So Judith Kalem, please, we're unmuting you. Go ahead and ask your question. Judith.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to our panelists with all the information that is very useful. I particularly was excited by the reframing of our partnerships that Hannah shared, and I think that is important. But I also acknowledge that partnerships are also a function of power. And we see a lot of power disequilibrium at many levels, both at the national, at the regional, and at the global level. And this equilibrium is also linked to power, which has to do with resources, whether financial, political, in many ways. So my question is really, but for us to be having real partnerships, we then need to destabilize this status quo that is currently there. Do you see the world moving towards there, or it remains rhetoric? What do we need to shift those power relations in a manner that will definitely bring genuine and real partnership? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Judith. I'm watching the clock, but what I'm going to do is ask, well, maybe Hannah and Laurel, if you have very brief answers to that particular question. And then I'm going to read out the last two questions, which I'm going to ask Florence, Laurel, and finally Hannah to respond briefly to, and then hopefully we end more or less on time. So Laurel, go ahead and answer about power relations first, and then I'll turn to Hannah, but if you can be succinct now. Yeah.
Will do. Judith, what a great question. And that could be a whole other webinar that maybe we should encourage Chatham House to hold. Look, here's what I think is important about the question that you're asking is that, the way that systems shift and move and transform is not from the center, and it tends not to be from the predominant power hierarchies. They have much less to gain from shifts than those that are at the periphery. So to me, the key is that we are listening into and providing spaces and opportunities for those that are less in the center of the dominant power hierarchy to speak and move and help to shape and transform systems. In the one example that I would give of where I have seen this be quite effective is in the run-up to the Food Systems Summit, which was held in September here in New York. And there was a tremendous effort that was put on rethinking dialogues, rethinking the way that we engage, and not talk into, but listen out of, and listen with a sort of a generative lens into these voices that are not often heard. They're not often respected. They're not often taken as seriously as they need to be. Indigenous wisdom is an obvious example of this. So I am seeing where this is starting to shift. It requires a very concerted, intentional effort and a willingness to listen into information that's not going to come at us in the same way as we might have presented it, right? But work through that. That, I think, is the potential to shift systems. And I do think that we are seeing some movement in that direction.
Thanks very much. Any quick thought, Hannah?
I would say it's also about coordination and various levels of coordination, especially for African countries. I think having the coordination through Africa CDC has been really important. AFCFTA, I think, can be used very well in order to kind of make the case for better investment and better partnerships with the African continent. Which do not, for example, end up just being extractive. And yeah, so I really think it's more coordination between African governments, not on trade, finance. I would encourage people to look up a concept that I've written about, my team have written about, called a borrower's club, which I think could also be very interesting to pursue.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to read out two final questions, not that you need to answer them if you don't want, but I'm going to go across the panel just for your final thoughts. So I'll start with Florence, then Hannah, end up with Laurel, so reverse order. The first question that is in the Q&A is from Nicholas Bass, who says, how do African countries, as in other continents, so as in other continents, they do not always act together, overcome the temptation to sell their extensive commodities on the global markets, which may serve richer countries' climate and carbon goals in the short term, rather than forego those profits and reinvest in their own green development, wealth creation and invention. Debt servicing, corruption, tariffs within Africa, vaccine access and hesitancy, food insecurity, etc., seem like massive hurdles for any country, let alone all acting together. So I think this is a question fundamentally about collectivism. So, you know, how do you get Pan-African vision? I mean, clearly in the response to the new variant, some country, I mean, SADC has split. So Angola's closed its borders to the rest of SADC. Rwanda has closed its borders. So, you know, you do have fragmentation. So how do you deal with that? You know, how do you avoid fragmentation, I suppose, is what is at the base of that question. And then Barry Tomlin says, China, friend of climate change, ? Belt and road investment in infrastructure development, Djibouti port, deforestation, mining and oil in Gabon and other countries, and resisting final conclusions of COP26 to not stop but pare down fossil fuel mining without defining targets. Have any African countries any influence on this? Do they have any? So this is a question really of what's Africa's agency over China? So now turning to the panel just for final observations, you don't need to answer those questions. I hand over first to Florence, your final observations, thoughts. What's the last thought you want to leave us all with?
Thank you very much, Alex, and my fellow panelists. I think a very, very interesting conversation. And I'd maybe just try and answer or try and speak to what Nicholas is raising. I think he's raising a very, very fundamental question about maybe one of the biggest challenges within the African continent in terms of acting together. I believe that, of course, that has always been one of the biggest challenges, and especially when it comes to how we utilize our own resources. Africa is is the richest continent in the world in terms of natural resource, and yet we are still grappling with a lot of poverty and many of the things that you have listed, like food insecurity, ongoing crisis after crisis. And so it's really something that has been ongoing for many years. And so one of the things I believe is, of course, there has to be more intention among African governments to come together, but also to have, first and foremost, to build better at country level, to organize better at country level internally for them, because sometimes when there's lack of internal systems that really speak in terms of resource utilization, resource how resources are utilized, but also how resources are we bring them together. Many times we lose out as a people in Africa. And so, of course, again, we all know that there's many times why there's no, the act of togetherness is because of external interference by many other continents that are, of course, that speaks to other, I do not want to mention names, but we all know that there's a lot of interference that happens. And of course, this interference is many times when it comes to resources, and the wars that are going on, like in a country like DRC Congo and many others, where there's maybe just resources like oil and so forth, is because of external interference and of course lack of proper systems internally. And so how then do we ensure that we can first and foremost identify the actual problems, why Africa is in this particular state, and what's fueling some of these challenges, and how then do we, from an international perspective, encourage or support better ways of coming together, and also what's the role of regional bodies like the African Union, but also these other bodies within the continent, and how can they play their roles effectively. I believe so these are some of the critical questions, and of course there's been a lot of recommendations. There's many times what needs to be done, but the challenges of why this is not being done, and especially because the external interference, in my opinion, many times result to a lot of exploitation in terms of resources, and also ensuring that corruption, our people will never access basic commodities or needs, or will never benefit from some of these day-to-day trades, that the trading that goes on for natural resources benefits a few of the ruling class, but not the communities. So I believe these are some of the critical conversations, but again, my question would be, what is the role of all of us as international community, countries that are fueling some of these injustices, and we also as the local countries, or the countries that may be at the center of this particular discussion, what is being done to ensure that in the coming generations we could have a better, or an Africa, for example, that is better able to handle its own resources and is able to make its own decisions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Florence, and so important that you end up again on the point of African agency. Hannah, final thought from you.
Yeah, let me fully agree with what Florence has just said. I think, number one, stick to Agenda 2063. All of it's there. The push to move away from extractive commodities towards value addition, the green development, environmental management, all of it's there, increased infrastructure, etc. So one of us, two, work to shift the system. So what South Africa and others have been leading in the WTO as an example of, changing the waiver system, trying to get a waiver is a really good example. It's not been easy, and it still is a struggle, but I do think it's important to continue to bring to the fore those sorts of struggles through the multilateral system and work for reform of the multilateral system. Number three, coordinate on policies. I think we're starting to do this really well through the AFCFTA. AFCFTA will take us into not just trade tariffs, but is also going to take us into how we coordinate our investment policy, how we coordinate our environmental policy, and so on. So that is going to be fundamental. And I think, again, coordination is going to be helpful for acting together. And last but not least, talking about China, there is a lot of misinformation on China. Once you put China into context and compare it to other countries, for example, there's actually less natural resources that go to China than to the EU. So it's not, yes, there are many issues with China, but many of these issues with China are actually issues that we have with most of our development partners. So how do we make sure that the African perspective is really incorporated and pushed through in opportunities such as COP26? There was a massive push on China on coal. There wasn't a big push on the US on gas, but from an African perspective, China reducing coal and US reducing gas is pretty much equivalent. It doesn't matter where the emissions are. So why wasn't there an equivalent push? So I think we need to still work on what the African position is on some of these issues and put that forward in multilateral forums. Again, I do believe it's possible.
Thank you, Hannah. And Laurel, final observation, thought from you.
Thank you so much. And not to repeat what others have said, which I also fully agree with, what I think is going to be important for the continent and for us going forward is this notion of reimagining development pathways. And to be able to do that, we need structures, we need systems, we need spaces where we can imagine better futures. Most studies show that when people imagine the future, you imagine more or less the way that it is today or something worse. And if we're going to make progress in terms of transforming development pathways, we need to be able to imagine, articulate in detail. We have to be able to feel what that future could look like and work backwards from it. So I think there's a lot of interesting work in this space, absolutely on the continent, that needs to be brought into. But I think that collective ability to imagine the future in detail that we want is really, really an important skill that we need to bring in. Two other things that I've mentioned, but I'll reinforce it again, is an evidence base. So how are we creatively using different forms of data, playing it forward? What does it look like if I combine it in this way or in that way, if I play it to 2030 or 2050? The way that we use data to help us think through options rather than single point solutions, I also think is key. And a last point on leadership. And it goes also to the question that Judith asked, but both Hannah and Florence have mentioned this. We have to get out of associating the notion of leadership with one of dominance of particular systems. Leadership is every person in this room. And we've seen this in COVID, where people have taken leadership in their communities, incredible acts of courage and bravery every day. That has to be what we leave with going forward. So I think reimagining what leadership needs to look like is so important for us to be able to drive forward. And I think there's tremendous examples of it out there. That's where I think we need to be shining a light and sort of focusing our learning into. Thank you so much, Alex.
Thank you very much. So I've just got two things. First of all is to thank you, well, three things. Thank the audience. Those of you who have been on Zoom and have been asking the questions and been following through for the last 90 minutes, this discussion. But also those of you who are on Facebook Live that haven't been able to ask questions, but have been following through the discussion and participating. Thank you very much. I want to thank our panelists in particular for staying the course over these last 90 minutes. So Laurel in New York and Hannah in Dakar and Florence here in Nairobi with me. Thank you so much. This has been a really invigorating, important discussion. And finally, I want to just remind you all that there will be another event before the end of the year, Christmas, of this series that we're doing in partnership, Chatham House UNDP, on policy for recovery in Africa. And that will take place on Wednesday, the 15th of November. And the topic will be regional development planning and coordination. This event, that particular 15th of December event, will include a keynote address from Ambassador Mama Nuhu, who's the Executive Secretary of the Lake Chad Basin Commission. We very much hope you'd like to join us for that. And just like today, we will be providing simultaneous translation, so there will be French and English available. So that's all for now. Thank you again for joining today, this discussion on Partnership for Sustainable Development. And I want to say good afternoon and good evening from Nairobi. I'm Alex Vines, Director of the Africa Program at Chatham House. Thank you, everybody. Stay safe, stay well.